All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight at the 2021 Townsend Keynote public event with the RASC Montreal Center. My name's Kareem Jaffer. I'm the Public Events Coordinator and the Astronomy Prof at John Abbott College. Those of you that have been here for the last few minutes have heard a few of the introductions. I'll give you a few more introductions. We have with us our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Howell, who's a space journalist. I'll be introducing her shortly. We have Paul Simard, who's the president of the RASC Montreal Center, and David Levy, who is our honorary president of the Montreal Center. We also have Nicole Laporte, who's our members liaison. We have Jessica Socher, who's the president of the John Abbott College Space Club, and Santiago Lopez, who is our RASC Montreal Center observing coordinator. So before I jump into anything about tonight's event or anything about the RASC Montreal Center itself, we like starting off with a land and sky acknowledgement. Now, the land and sky acknowledgement is our attempt at recognizing that the sky, the stars that we watch, that we enjoy through the night, they're not just ours. They've been here since the dawn of time. The peoples of Canada and the peoples of the earth have been enjoying them, and they have their own legends and their own stories about them. And we tend to put our public events on the full moon night because the full moon prevents a little bit of our observing that we want to do of deep sky objects. And so the full moon at the moment is the mate calling moon, because this is the time towards the fall where most of the animals do mate and they do have their entire mating ritual. And so the Mi'kmaq Moons Project is one that was put together to try to preserve the way in which these names of these moons are called throughout time. So I want to share with you the Mi'kmaq moon for September. So Wagumke Wagus is what we call the moon right now. And this is a picture taken by one of our John Abbott College students a couple of years ago, and he has kindly offered for me to be able to share it during our public events. The other thing that we see in a lot of these legends is we see behavior that is scientific in nature caught up in their legends. So there's what we call two-eyed seeing, which is using one eye to view from the indigenous people's stories and one eye to see the science within. So one of the ones that I like talking about whenever we're discussing Mars is Mars retrograde motion. Because Mars retrograde motion, when you see it move through the night sky, you actually see it turn back on itself during part of its orbit because of the way in which the solar system orbits are viewed from different planets. So the Cree in the plains areas and the middle provinces of Canada, they refer to this as the moose spirit. And the reason is because when a moose is scared, the moose actually will run in a circle before it continues forward to see if it identifies any reason for it to actually be startled and for it to change its path. So Mars kind of moving back on itself is referred to as the moose spirit. So when we go out at night for our observing events, which hopefully we'll be able to start doing with the public again soon enough in a more sustained fashion, we invite you to look at the sky, not just with the stories that you hear from Western astronomy, but also with your culture, your native or your historical traditions, and find the science within. Now for tonight, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the RASC and the RASC Montreal Center. But before we do that, I want to introduce to you our honorary president, David Levy. And David's going to share with us a reading for tonight. David?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to add my welcome to this very auspicious Townsend lecture tonight with Dr. Howell. This is the Townsend lecture. The history of it is so prestigious. When I first joined the RASC, I think the first Townsend lecture I ever attended was Dr. Gerald Clemens. And the only thing I remember about that lecture is that he always pronounced galaxy, which always surprised me. We've had lectures like Carl Sagan, but I think tonight's lecture is going to be very, very special. One of the most important lectures of Townsend lectures that we've had was Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. Wonderful sense of humor. And Ms. Williamson, who was active at the time, said, I'd like to introduce you to to Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, perhaps the most famous woman astronomer of all. To which she responded, I may not be the most famous, but I certainly am the tallest. Anyway, I have a little poetic quote that I'd like to give to you right now. This quote was sent to me by Karim a number of months ago, and it's always been one of my favorites. It's by Georges Bugnet, written around 1938. And it goes like this. Vu que la nuit couvre les voiles, pour nous laisser notre éclat emprunté, source de feu, sovereign clarté, étoile, reine des étoiles. You that the night covers with sails, to let us borrow our brilliance, source of fire, sovereign clarity, star, queen of the stars. Thank you, and back to you, Kareem.
Thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure. For one thing, during COVID that's been new is we've been able to have David Levy share with us his thoughts at the start of all of not just our public events, but even our clubhouses. He has been joining us twice a week, every week, when we've been doing our clubhouses. He's been on every Tuesday night with the Global Star Parties with Explore Alliance. He joins the Kingston group every week, and I know he joins several others as well. So I am really admiring your incredible stamina in continuing to give us these amazing quotes every single week. I now want to introduce you all. Oh, thanks, David. I want to introduce you all to Paul Simard. He is our RASC Montreal Center president, and he's going to take over from here. Paul?
Good evening. I'll try anyway. Let's see. Can we see this? Do we see this?
We can.
Yes?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, which was founded in 1868, has been Canada's leading astronomy organization with over 4,000 amateur, educator, and professional astronomers. We are the largest, most active astronomy group in Canada. Our vision, to inspire curiosity in all Canadians about the universe, to share scientific knowledge, and to foster collaboration in astronomical pursuits. And our mission, to encourage improved understanding of astronomy for all people through education, outreach, research, publication, partnership, enjoyment, and community. By joining RASC, you'll get Sky News, our astronomy magazine, the Observer's Handbook, and also you'll have access to our program, Explore the Universe, which is aimed at novice visual astronomers. Youth members may also be able to receive the Next Gen Post-Secondary Scholarship if they enroll in full-time post-secondary studies related to the STEM field. Or in the case of the Community Leadership Fund, which provides funds towards an astronomy-based community outreach project. You may find more information about this on the RASC National website, or you can ask your local, one of your local center reps. The Montreal Center was established back in 1918. We have currently over 160 active members. We currently hold 2 virtual meetings, or actually on the rare occasion, because of the situation, rare occasion we have some member get-togethers to do some observing, but mostly we do 2 virtual meetings per week. We have an observatory out in the Morgan Arboretum in St. Anne, which is we call the Bellevue. It's a 14-inch Meade LX200R, which is supported by an Iotron CEM-120 mount. We also have a 16-inch, what we refer to as a light bucket, down in Woolly Woods, which is down in the South Shore of just south of Montreal. And we called that Bumblebee simply because of its black and yellow trim. We have observing events. Under normal circumstances, we would have observing events, workshops and clubhouses at the Arboretum, and we have monthly public talks and star parties and such. We have a library, a well-stocked library, which we refer to as the I.K. Williamson Library after Isabel Williamson, which David has mentioned, at the John Abbott College. although right now we don't really have access, but if you want to borrow a book, contact one of the members of the Montreal Center and maybe we could try and work something out. Telescope rentals, normally we would do this too, but because of the COVID, that's a little difficult to arrange, but who knows. We also have a newsletter called Skyward, which comes out every 2 months. And what else? And we do also outreach to local groups and libraries in the community, just to promote astronomy as much as possible. Right now, most of the time we have Zoom meetings twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays. But we try to get out, having members observing at the Morgan Arboretum. But we have to sign up, so because we have to keep the numbers to a minimum, to a certain number of people. Else, like I said, we get together on Zoom meetings at 8 p.m. on Wednesdays and Saturdays. But occasionally we also have special talks, like the upcoming one on September 22nd by Jane Lubinensky. The title is all about Cyril in a nutshell. Please come and please, if you're a member, please come and see it. Membership is regularly $97. Youth is $55.25 if you're between 16 and 21. And we have family plans, which is $91.50 for the first member and $13 per additional adult, $7.10 per youth. And with that, I shall pass it on to Santiago, who will describe all the certificates that we have for observers to try and get.
Okay, here I am.
I shall stop sharing. There you go.
And, okay, I was going to do a presentation, and maybe I will give you a little quick little look at some certificates here. So I'll share my screen. Here we go. Yeah, the RASC has quite a few certificate programs. For visual observing, you got the Explore the Universe is a very nice place to get started on if you're interested in doing kind of organizing, planning your observing, and you need some kind of direction where to go on. Do look this up, Explore the Universe. It's a very nice way to look at the various objects, the moon, stars, the planets, and there's a certificate that you can get. And have a look at this webpage over here. Maybe I'll put her on the, well, I'll copy it onto the chat a little later. For now, I wanted to do a presentation tonight. It's one of our members achieved this one here, the Explore the Moon. And she's on the screen right now. It's Nicole Laporte. So it's a great pleasure to mention that she's completed the Explore the Moon program. It's a program to observe 94 features of the moon and record them in your own logbook, along with relevant details, sky conditions, telescope characteristics, the magnification, and any observing remarks or details that you may have noticed. And while Nicole did this fabulously well with art, great detail, she went over the 94 features and went up to 103 and recorded them all in her logbook. And here's, I'll show you a little example of what she did over here. This one is, look at this, Bay of Rainbows in Sirius Iridium. It's an excellent example of what a logbook looks like. So here we go. Log number 90 of Jura Mountains on this particular date from this location and sky conditions. She used a 60mm refractor. Nicole has a knack for taking little old scopes and bringing them back to life and bringing out the most that you can extract from them. And this is what you can see with a 6mm eyepiece, a 60mm refractor, magnification of only 117, and a polarizing filter. You can see the great details of the moon. Now, of course, maybe you don't need to go all this way, but Nicole does tend to do fabulous work. And if you're interested in any hints and tips on how to do this sort of thing, I'm sure that Nicole can offer you some tips a little later on or at some other time. Myself and Terry reviewed her work this last week or a couple of weeks ago and submitted her logbook to National. I don't know if she's received her certificate and pin yet.
No, I haven't. I check the
Not
mailbox
yet?
every day.
You get the feeling that maybe they're a little short-staffed over there, and but anyways, you deserved it more than most people would, and I'm quite happy to have reviewed this. Terry mentioned he was quite thrilled just going page by page. It's quite fabulous. So congratulations, Nicole, and
Thank you.
good luck to anyone who wants to try this out. It's an excellent way to focus your attention and learn a lot of new things, and it's not nearly as difficult as you might imagine. And with that, I will stop sharing. And who's next?
That would be me again. Just one moment here. There we go. And we'll go right back to here. So as Santiago and Nicole talked about these observing programs, Nicole actually runs our members services. So she talks to the members about these observing programs. And every year during the International Observe the Moon Night, she talks about the Explore the Moon certificate. So it's fantastic that she was able to get this awesome certificate. And her sketching at the telescope is one of the really amazing things about our members' nights as well as our public nights, is seeing her set up with the refractor and taking what she sees in the eyepiece and bringing it to life on her sketch pad or on her black paper, on her white paper. It's just, it really inspires us to pay more attention to the detail of what we see. And this is part of what the RASC is all about. There's not just the members programs that we do to support members directly, but also just that collegiality, that environment of sharing our own tools, our own way of doing things on the field when we're with our equipment. And everybody has different equipment that they prefer to use. And during our public events, we try to share this as best as we can with people who might have an interest in astronomy, who might have an excitement for astronomy, but might not know the place to start out. So our next public event after tonight is actually a really cool one being developed by our outreach coordinator, Russell Freilich. He spent some time in New Zealand a couple of years back, and we decided that because we are at 45 degrees north latitude, there are stars we see that they cannot see down in New Zealand. And they're at 45 degrees south, so there's stars they see that we can never see up here in the north. So next Saturday night, we are doing a global star party with Explore Alliance, hosted by Explore Scientific and Scott Roberts. And we are going to be sharing the views of the northern sky and the southern sky between ourselves and the Dunedin Astronomical Society in New Zealand. So you're welcome to join us. It's explorescientific.com/live. And our public events are, as Paul mentioned, monthly. So we have the 45 degree star party later this month. We have the International Observe the Moon Night on October 16th. And for that, because we're still not sure what the COVID situation will be, we've decided to set up a talk on the moons, not just ours, but the moons of the solar system. And Chuck Allen, the vice president of the Astronomical League in the States, is one of our local members. He doesn't live here, but he likes the Montreal Center, so he's joined us. And he's going to be sharing a great talk on the objects in the solar system that we don't tend to pay too much attention to all the time. We look at the planets because they're huge. We look at the sun because it's massive and it's there and it sustains life. But the moons have a lot to be said for them. And a lot of them are the place where we think we'll find life in our solar system. So Chuck is going to share with us a talk on the moons of the solar system at 4 o'clock. And we're still trying to organize something in person or online for that night to be able to share views of the moon with our Montreal public. As well, in December, we have a talk on the Apollo moon rocks by Gavin Tolometti, who's a PhD student at University of Western Ontario. And he's going to be talking about the moon rocks from Apollo that were actually stored away in the 70s to wait for better equipment, better tools to analyze them. And now they're being opened up and they're being analyzed with the current tools and technology that we have. So he's going to share with us a little bit of insight on that. You'll notice there's no public event in November, and that's because in November, we have our annual general meeting for the RASC Montreal Center. So if you're a member and you're listening and you have an idea or something you want to do with the exec, please do contact us and let us know. There is room for more people in the exec, and it's great to actually have elections sometimes and not just have people who decide to stay on, but have a couple of different people with a couple of different ideas for the members to choose what direction they want certain portfolios in the club to go. So we invite you all to please do participate. And one thing that you'll notice is that a lot of us are active, not just at the local level, but also at the national level. We have 2 members who are chairs of national committees. Myself, I'm on the Education Public Outreach Committee, and Russell, our outreach coordinator, is involved in rebranding and redeveloping our novice astronomy program, which hopefully next year we'll be able to start offering classes on different elements in astronomy to our members to just help for those, especially that are just starting out. Now, tonight's special talk is, one more thing before I forget. We actually have partner institutions here in Montreal, and one of them is Astro McGill and the McGill Space Institute. And on this Mars theme that we're talking about tonight, they actually have a Mars panel happening later this week, and it's going to be on Facebook Live. And there are 3 panelists, including Richard Leveille, who's a professor at John Abbott College with me, and one of our former speakers at the RASC Montreal Center. So if you're interested, please do attend. It's on Facebook Live. Just look for Astro McGill or the McGill Space Institute. And if you want to send in any questions ahead of time, contact me by email and I'll help you to do that. Now, tonight is one of our Townsend Lectures. And our Townsend Lectures are our keynote public event of the year, not necessarily because it's the one that we pay the most to bring a speaker in for, or the one where the most people will show up, but it's because it's one that we choose in a specific fashion. What we do is we try to pick a topic or a thematic area in astronomy and space science that is in the news, that is current. And we try to bring in a speaker that can share that passion and that information and why this is important to pay attention to the entire Montreal public, as well as to our members, a lot of whom don't have access to all of this information either. And the Townsend Public Lectures started, as David mentioned, in the mid-1950s with a bequest from a longtime member who had passed away, G. Horsley Townsend, and he bequeathed the RASC Montreal Center with a couple of observing tools, but also with some monies to help the club because the club was facing lean times. And what the club decided to do was to invest some of that money in better equipment, but also to invest some of that money to bring astronomy to Montreal, to the public here in our area. And that started in 1956 with a lecture by Dr. Harlow Shapley, one of the first to determine the actual shape and size of our Milky Way. And so since then, we have had astronauts, we have had communicators, we have had researchers, we have had scientists, and we have had program managers. We've had artists, we've had literary professionals, and we've had musicians come and give talks for the Townsend. And so tonight, we are really privileged to have with us Elizabeth Howell. Now, Elizabeth Howell is a freelance space journalist for Space.com and SpaceQ. She's a communications prof at Algonquin College and a regular contributor to the Sky News magazine. I first got to talk to Elizabeth through Sky News when she interviewed me for a section on astronomy in the classroom. But what really struck me was earlier this summer when I was on a panel show with Astro Radio in the UK, and it was Reach Out and Touch Space panel, and we had on Nicholas Booth. Now, Nicholas had co-written a book with Elizabeth on the search for life on Mars. And when I was chatting with him offline after the actual radio part of the show, he mentioned that he can't believe we haven't had Elizabeth as a speaker. And I said, you're right, I can't believe we haven't had Elizabeth as a speaker. So I reached out and she was more than happy to say yes, because in her background, she really wants to bring science to people, especially to an audience of not just the general public, not just members and enthusiasts, but also youth. So Elizabeth has wanted to be an astronaut since she watched Apollo 13 back in 1996. And I think a lot of us can remember that feeling of seeing Tom Hanks involved in that and also reading the real stories of the astronauts involved in Apollo 13. So while she hasn't flown to space yet, she did get to live in a Martian analog base, use a spacesuit, and she has completed a PhD in aerospace sciences. Her latest book was with Canadian astronaut Dave Williams. It's called Leadership Moments from NASA, and it's available now at ECW Press. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Howell, and I'm going to ask all members who have, or all attendees who have questions, to please post them in the Q&A or the chat, And Jessica Socher and myself will be monitoring the questions, and we'll bring them to Elizabeth at the end of the webinar. So Elizabeth, we are all yours.
Everyone, Kareem, everyone, I'm just so eminently flattered to be here in this esteemed company. I'm sitting here with people I have been fans of ever since that era when I saw Apollo 13. And by the way, for all the Girl Guides watching, if I'd known, I would have mentioned right in my biography that I was a Girl Guider around that time. I finished Girl Guides and I did a couple of years of Pathfinders. And so I know how much it teaches you about working in teams in remote circumstances, which is exactly what you need to learn to be an astronaut. And so I just want to give a special welcome to all of you. And if any of you happen to be homeschoolers, I used to be a homeschooler as well. So I got another little notch in the Venn diagram of interesting experiences that I hope that you'll find useful. So let me make sure I can get my screen going. I was very humbled, by the way, when RASC Montreal approached me to do this keynote speech for the reasons I've already indicated, because I really do see my job as trying to lift up others, especially the youth that I am so lucky to get to work with almost every day, actually, in my jobs. And I'm not used to talking much about myself. I would rather promote what they do, you know, but if anything, when I look back at my career as a journalist, I think it's kind of like that old Japanese proverb that I've seen online, and it says something like, fall 7 times, stand up 8. I don't speak Japanese, so it might not be an exact translation there, but fall 7 times, stand up 8. I needed help to stand up every time I fell because that's how the world works. We don't work by ourselves, and not everybody is that lucky, especially in journalism. I'll allude to that from time to time, but it's a tough field, and I'm very lucky to have the network of folks, including people that I interact with daily. They're sitting right there in the audience. I'm so lucky to have them in my lives. And so thank you to my readers, my clients, my family, my friends for helping me stay standing over the years. And thank you, of course, here to RASC Montreal for bringing me here tonight, because my goal in talking about my experiences is that we can learn a few things about space together. So let's get started. On a busy day in January 2014, my Mars crew discovered we would have a water shortage for 4 days. Our business manager from Harlem put in crew water restrictions. Our daughter from Paris ensured crew health would be protected. Our crew commander from Upper New York State kept up our motivation because, after all, we were not able to shower properly, right? Our engineers from Arizona and Florida rigged up supplementary water systems. And meanwhile, I kept writing news stories for space.com about our science. That's because the science was what we wanted to focus on, not the missing showers, as uncomfortable as it might have felt at that time. I mentioned this moment not to complain, it's just something that happens when you're working in a remote environment, but this moment during Cruise 133's mission, you see our mission patch there, shows the value of diversity. Our crew spoke at least 4 different languages. Those were the languages I was hearing. It wasn't necessarily even all the languages they knew. We had a plurality of genders, races, incomes, and countries in a very small space. And we did our best to respect the land around us because we knew we were strangers and that the land actually belonged to others. Indeed, I deliver my lecture here today from Ottawa, atop the unceded land of the Algonquin people. So on Mars, we leaned upon our diversity to solve problems. The water crisis was just one of them. We struggled with food supplies. Our technology kept breaking. Our internet was terrible at best. And yet, we kept doing our experiments and running our spacewalks, and because that's what it means to be a space crew. You have to be productive even when things are deviating from the plan. So here, and this is a lovely picture from one of my crew members, Mathieu. All of these pictures, unless they're otherwise acknowledged, by the way, are from my crew, Crew 133. And I will drop the fiction here because if you've been listening to the introduction, you know that, of course, we weren't on Mars, literally on Mars, but we sure were simulating it as best as we could. We were in a facility, which you can see here, known as the Mars Desert Research Station in the middle of the Utah desert. It's somewhere near a small town called Hanksville. And for those listening in during the introduction, as far as I know, there's no connection with Tom Hanks, but it was just too perfect for a longtime fan like myself. It's run by the Mars Society, another nonprofit, and the rules of the game sound simple. You work in crowded corners with a crew. Usually you stay on site for 2 weeks and you do science most of the day. If you leave the habitat to go outside, you put on a simulated spacesuit, which I'll show you, or I think you've seen a picture already, but I'll have more to show you. And if you communicate with mission control, There's a 20-minute time delay because if you've done your reading about Mars, you know that there's usually a bit of time between when we send the commands to the rover and when the rover responds, right? Now, most years, not pandemic years, of course, the facility has crews of students and researchers figuring out all the ways that space is dangerous and can potentially kill you. We try to make these future space missions safer by simulating it in a isolated, confined environment. So we do experiments, we ride on rovers, we live off shelf-stable food, just like astronauts do, just like the inspiration for a crew. The nearest sheriff was a 20-minute drive away over really treacherous and tricky terrain. The nearest medevac would take a couple of hours to reach us at best, okay? And only a few months after my mission, a huge fire broke out and burned down the greenhouse. The firefighters couldn't get there fast enough, so the crew had to stop the flames by themselves from consuming the nearby habitat because the greenhouse was here, the habitat was here, and there was a danger it would spread. No one got hurt, luckily, but it goes to show you, yes, we were isolated. Yes, it was dangerous, but that's also life in space. You probably have heard of a Canadian astronaut named Chris Hadfield, who's pictured here. If you know him, maybe you had the time and luck to read his book, which is excellent. It's called An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. I brought a copy with me to Utah and I read the whole thing again. I've probably read it about 10 times since it came out, but I'm going to quote from the book here. He says, "In any new situation, whether it involves an elevator or a rocket ship, you will almost certainly be viewed in one of three ways, okay? As a -1, actively harmful, someone who creates problems, or as a 0, your impact is neutral and doesn't tip the balance one way or the other, or you'll be seen as a +1, someone who actively adds value." Colonel Hadfield explains that your mission in space is to be a 0, so don't toot your horn, don't hurt the mission, instead help the others. Help the others more than they need to be helped. That's being the 0. Colonel Hadfield also talks about the times he was not a 0 in space. Now, to be sure, he was usually way more than a 0 in space. That's why he's the person he is. But he does have those moments where he is looking for ways to grow. And one time he got disinfectant in his eye during a spacewalk. I don't know if it was literally the spacewalk you see here, but it was during one of them. And he was blinded and they almost had to stop the whole thing. And that happened, he found out later, because before he went out there, he was scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing on the visor, that big glass thing in front of him. He wanted to have a really, really clean visor before he went outside. And so he scrubbed, he scrubbed, he scrubbed, and some of the disinfectant got left behind. And in space, because everything floats, it floated into his eye. And that could very well have been a bad day. Sometimes I wasn't a 0 in Utah. My survival skills frankly sucked. On one hiking trip, I was climbing a small ridge and then I stopped because I realized I couldn't climb up safely. I didn't know how to do that, but worse, I also couldn't climb down safely. So I was stuck on this ridge. If I fell, I was high enough that I probably would hurt myself. And so I had to ask my commander for help. She was right there with me because in spacewalking, you always have at least 2 people for that reason. If something goes wrong, the other person can hopefully help you out. So she had to stop her science work to help me. Like, how embarrassing, to tell me how to climb down. And that was stupid of me, but she helped. She did her job and she did a great job that day. And that was great. But seriously, one mistake in an environment like that and you can get hurt, you can die. You could stop a mission and its science and all the years of work that your crew put in. So please take the lesson that I didn't take, train yourself a little bit more thoroughly before embarking on such an adventure and be the 0. In life even, if you take the attitude in life that your life's goal is to be the 0, your life is going to change. I only met my husband after I went to Utah. And that's because I acted like a 0 around him. The mission taught me through experiences like that, how to be a 0. I always did more than I asked. And what's also important, two-way street, right? He always did the same for me. And we've been together for 7 years. We just had our 5-year anniversary a couple days ago. And we know that that's the key, being a 0. We are, in fact, 0s together. Schools adore 0s, workplaces adore 0s, Girl Guides adore 0s. And by the way, if your surrounding environment does not appreciate your 0, you need to get out. Get out as fast and safely as you can and be a 0 somewhere else. Now, I know that's easy for me to say. I'm sitting here on a screen. You never met me, perhaps. Get out. What do you mean get out? Don't you know I have money problems? Don't you know I have life problems? And so I want to acknowledge, of course, as I'm sitting here, I have immense privilege to have the opportunity to be here, let alone to have experienced the things that I have. I must acknowledge my profound luck, but I also promise you this, that if you're zero, if you're mission focused in the way that I described, things often spin your way in the long run, okay? So not always, I can't make you 100% of a promise, but usually enough that over time, your circumstances will change. So let's talk about another moment in my career, much earlier. There was a moment when I got laid off. All right, I lost my job. In fact, there were a lot of moments when I lost my job because I was unlucky enough to graduate into the recession back in 2008. And I also was, in a sense, when it comes to the layoffs, unlucky enough to choose journalism as a career. I love journalism and I'm very happy to be a journalist. I get to meet such smart people and interact with them every day, but you may have observed there are fewer journalists around now than there were maybe about 20 years ago, about the time I was graduating. Great career choice, Elizabeth. But long ago, a movie said there was no crying in baseball. And it's almost as true to say, well, both that there's no crying in journalism and also that there might be no money in journalism. But you find ways if you can. So during this particular layoff, I left the workplace in the pouring rain because of course it was going to rain, right? I forgot my umbrella because I might have been a little bit distracted by losing the job and I was soaked. I took a bus. What else can you do? I went home. I went into my 1-bedroom apartment. So here was where I made a choice, okay? It was a very bad day. I was soaked, no umbrella, no job. What do? I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't, okay? I didn't drink or do anything foolish like that, at least not right away. Instead, I made a bunch of phone calls. I called every connection I could think of, friends, family, workplaces, everything I could do. 24 hours later, I had an interview, a solid interview with a solid potential. And 31 hours after I walked out in the pouring rain, I had another job. Now, of course, I know I was lucky, right? But I also chose to respond positively to a bad day, and it happened to work out. And even if it had worked out, by the way, in 2 weeks or 2 months, I still would have called that a success. It just happened to be 31 hours later. So why did it work out? Well, on the Monday morning, I lost my job. And on the Friday afternoon, I walked into the new job for training. And the first thing a senior reporter said, a senior reporter I was watching on TV from childhood, by the way, he said, "We read your stuff all the time." And he said, that's why they hired me. It wasn't because they felt sorry for me, but because they knew I was a zero. They knew that I would contribute. So in other words, they knew I'd support the team. I don't work there anymore, but my former coworkers remain close, and that's because they're zeros too. So be the zero. Okay. So you know the first principle of spaceflight I learned on my Martian expedition. I already talked a bit about the second. Embrace diversity. And by which I mean defend it. Defend it in the face of racism, of sexism, of all the other nasty kinds of isms that you see on social media and in your everyday life. I didn't do that on Mars, and my actions almost killed the mission. So a few of my crew members thought they would play a practical joke on someone else. It's that kind of thing that happens sometimes when you're in a team. I won't get into the details because these are private, but they told me not to say a word. So I let them peer pressure me into silence when I should have spoken out. And after the joke was played, the affected crew member was very upset, justifiably so, and they decided they were going to leave. We're out there in the Utah desert and they're going to figure this out. And so they started to buy Greyhound tickets on our internet connection and, you know, to make a few moves to start getting out of the habitat. And they dropped out of all mission tasks for a couple of days. Now, there were only 6 of us, and one of them was now gone, right? We needed this person to stay. They were about to leave, and we had made a very, very, very bad choice. And we were very lucky that after a couple of days, we had a few ways of sort of approaching this person, apologizing. We had ways of sort of rectifying what had happened. This person was generous enough to accept our apologies and change their mind. But after that incident, I knew that I had to change because that was unacceptable, that I'd pushed somebody to that limit. So on Mars, I mentioned that we were diverse and that we needed that diversity to survive. And so the way that I decided to learn was to listen to what the others had to say. So learning life skills from somebody who grew up in Harlem was extremely humbling. Learning cooking skills from a person who has wilderness first aid certification gives you a new perspective on food and its importance in our lives. And at night, I was lucky enough to receive business lessons from somebody who worked at a huge computer company as a senior executive. And during the day, of course, I was picking up words in 4 different languages from all of my crewmates. And so being on Mars was kind of like being, well, here in a meeting of the RASC, where you get to have all these different folks coming in, and also perhaps in a school or a post-secondary environment in the right circumstances. But unfortunately, though, we know that the world isn't always that open. So this July 2021, was a very busy month for me. So you might have heard that a couple of billionaires launched into space on basically their own rockets, the rockets that their companies built. I won't repeat the mission details here because there's been so much coverage about it. And of course, I contributed to that coverage. It was part of my job. But what was interesting was that without even having a real, we have to talk about this moment, my colleagues and I decided not to get too excited. It was interesting, but we decided not to get too excited because we had, from years of experience, an unspoken sense of how to be zeros in this situation. And we raised some critical questions, and we'll continue to raise them, by the way, because we all knew in our heart that diversity matters. And that's why we wanted to pursue this. And so in our coverage and also in our conversations, this is some of the stuff that we were talking about, okay? Just some things to think about. I don't have the answers to these yet. I'm not that smart, and I may never do, but I do think about these questions a lot as I'm writing my stories. So why should a rich person decide who will launch with them into space? In other words, why can they choose their crewmates? Why was everybody on these missions looking very similar to each other, right? It's 14 hours of training, which is what one of the missions received, enough to really understand how space is so dangerous. And should we really be spending our money on this, honestly, right? I've got to ask that question because people ask it of me all the time, so I need to ask that as well. Every organization has blind spots like this, to be sure, and I'm not trying to be unfair in asking these questions of them, because I have blind spots too. But the point is to make sure that we know that we have these blind spots and that we have to stop our mistakes immediately when we discover these blind spots, especially in space, which, as I mentioned, is dangerous. Now, happily, this week, indeed, this evening, we just saw the conclusion of another billionaire mission go in a different direction. It was called Inspiration 4. I won't, again, get into the details, but you can read about it. And it squarely had science and charity as part of its mandate along with the space mission. So it was still a billionaire mission, but it was far more diverse. For example, they had the first Black female astronaut pilot sitting on their spacecraft. And they also had the first person fly with a prosthetic limb. So it was really fun to watch for those reasons. And I hope that we take the lessons learned from this mission and build an even more interesting billionaire mission the next time it happens, because we all know what's going to happen. So from time to time, somebody asked me how we can have a government space program in Canada when Indigenous communities around the country, for example, don't have safe drinking water. And I adore space, to be sure, and I still hope to participate in it as best as I can. But again, those are valid questions, and I also think about them often. I'm not a policy expert, especially during an election. I have to be sure I tell you that, but I always answer that question in a couple of ways. So the first is hold those politicians accountable. So when you have the time or the privilege to interact with them, ask these questions, see what they have to say. And then I also say that while space can provide some solutions to these problems through, say, technology development, it's not a panacea. I would love, by the way, to see more Indigenous people participating in our country's space program at all levels, as engineers, as astronauts, as astronomers. Because right now, for example, the sky is under threat from satellite constellations. And so I don't mean those constellations of stars that you start to learn as you're learning your way around the sky, but that's swarms of satellites that are working together in space. And they provide some vital services such as broadband internet in the north, which doesn't have a lot of access. But I can only imagine what it might feel like to be Indigenous and to realize that your very stars and stories might be taken away from you too, along with everything else that has been lost in our history, our Canadian history. So if we're not careful, these business interests and these blind spots will present a problem, a long, long problem. So again, embrace diversity, defend it, and use your privilege to give everybody a voice. So I promised RASC that I would spend part of this talk discussing how Mars influenced my own life. As a budding historian, I can only see my life, however, in the context of the environment and in the society in which I live. And as I've indicated, I too have blind spots, in part as a product of my privileged upbringing. But if I may draw a third lesson from the experience that's a bit more personal, outside of what was happening in the mission, I'd also like to talk about how Mars put me on a trajectory to visit Kazakhstan. So I should give you a few words about my background first. I feel that's important for you to know before venturing into my career. So I was very lucky. You know, my family, we weren't rich, but we always had enough. My parents taught me the value of education from a young age. I was at the library a lot. They helped homeschool me for a while. And my dad and my granddad were both involved in aviation. So that's probably part of the reason that I ended up in space. As a teenager, as the introduction indicated, I saw the movie Apollo 13 and was ready to be an astronaut that day. Sign me up, let me go. Instead, after going to journalism school at Carleton and taking a few other experiences, I ended up writing about them, writing about these astronauts as a career. And then nearly 20 years later, I got to go to Mars. And that put me on the path for Kazakhstan. So why? Well, first of all, you have to understand that I didn't get much privacy. As you can see here, it was pretty cramped quarters. I did have a little bedroom to myself, but it was very similar to what you might see on the space station. It was just big enough to hold a desk and a bunk bed. And otherwise, I spent my entire day with my great crew here. So I worked in this common room alongside my crewmates. It's now been modified somewhat if you were to visit the facility, but this is what it looked like back in 2014. And, you know, I cleaned, I cooked, I held other people's experiments, I followed directions on our spacewalks. And I also asked my crewmates advice before publishing anything about what we were doing. That way they were clear on what was going to happen from our lives that was going online. So after my terrible mistake that I mentioned earlier, I did my best to be a zero and to embrace diversity. But there was yet another lesson to learn a few years later when I got to go to Kazakhstan. So I'm going to jump over a few years of professional work very quickly, so please don't get dizzy. So I went to Mars in 2014 as a part of a group from the University of North Dakota. And I was there because I was in year 2 of my PhD at the university at the time. Later that year, I began to learn Russian because I wanted to go to Kazakhstan where they speak Russian, right? By the next year, so 2015, I was teaching in my first classrooms because I wanted to learn how to bring my message to youth as well as all the audiences I was writing for online. And I kept writing during this busy time as best as I could, and I kept attending all the Canadian astronaut press conferences. So part of my motivation was the goal. I wanted to go see a Canadian astronaut launch in Kazakhstan before NASA's Commercial Crew program began restarting the launches again from Florida. So I'm going to give you a bit of time travel again. Going even further back in time, this is my TV view of a space shuttle launch in 2006. And I was in Florida at the time, only a few minutes drive from the launch pad. And I got to explain why I'm sitting on a TV, room watching this instead of actually over there. So this was Steve McLean's launch, another Canadian astronaut. And I spent all my summer job money from university and I flew to Orlando to watch him. I was in midair in my plane, everything was going fine, but then the shuttle got struck by lightning. And so NASA spent a few days checking their systems, and by then, luck have it, a hurricane was on its way to the Space Coast. And so they had to pull the shuttle back to shelter, and this TV view is the shuttle moving back to shelter. So I couldn't go there, but I went to a dock. I wanted to see something. So I went to a dock. And this picture that you see here is as close as I got to the space shuttle in 2006. There's a bit of context. That's the Banana River, I believe, that's sort of in front of me. The vehicle assembly building, which is that big gray box almost on the right of there, is the place where it was going to. And I would really, really have to zoom in, but it's somewhere in the middle of the picture beside those what appear to be trees or bushes. That's where the shuttle is. And that's as close as I got. I was still several kilometers or miles away. So while this was happening, I was obviously immensely disappointed, but still watching. It was as close as I was going to get to a space shuttle on that trip. I noticed it stopped on its route back, right? And I thought I wasn't seeing things properly. It had been a tough day. And back then, this was before Twitter, before Facebook, before TikTok, clearly, there was no social media where I could get updates. I didn't even have internet. So I went to get my taxi and the driver was completely agitated. And she goes, "Did you hear the news? The storm shifted and they're putting the shuttle back to the pad." So the reason they stopped it was they were in the process of turning it around, which takes a while. There's a few technical checks you got to do along the way. And of course, I was on my way to the airport. It was too late. I couldn't stay. I inadvertently, though, saw a historical moment, and it was the only time the shuttle turned back around midway and went all the way back to the pad. That had never happened before, never happened since. So that at least was unique. However, I missed seeing a Canadian go into space, and that was what I wanted to do for a long time. So I was bitterly disappointed. I think I probably did cry that time in the airport, but there was nothing to do but carry on. So I went back to school, back to journalism school, to learn how to be a better journalist for the next time. That was all I could control, so that's what I did. So as it turned out, I was going to have to wait 12 years. Yeah, it was 12 years that I was going to have to wait. I think I would have cried a little more knowing that, but it was worth it. So in between 2006 and 2018, the program changed a lot. So NASA stopped using the space shuttle and began using Russian Soyuz spacecraft in about 2011, more frequently anyway. So that's not so affordable to fly from Canada to Kazakhstan now, right? And so I actually did have an invite to go see Chris Hadfield go into space in 2012, but that very weekend, I was closing on my first house, my first condo, and I didn't have the money to spare. So I waited and I just kept attending Canadian Space Agency events. I was convinced that somehow it was going to work. So finally, I'm going to get to my third lesson from Mars, which brought me through the Mars Desert Research Station and into Kazakhstan to cultivate connections. So after leaving Mars, I went home and I started to learn Russian, and I kept putting that mission first, to go see a Canadian fly from Kazakhstan. And that meant putting the Canadian Space Agency stories first, because most people only remember our astronauts when they fly in space. And that's really unfortunate, because they have very interesting stories to tell even in between, with the training they do, the connections that they make, the stuff that they learn. There's a Canadian astronaut about right now, or he might have just come home, that was on a remote expedition to study geology with Western University. So they do really cool things. And I kept going to their events and I kept covering their things because I knew that was important. I went to their training seminars. I even wrote a book about Canadian astronauts, which is called Canadarm in Collaboration, also with ECW. And guess what? Most of the book was about what astronauts do on the ground. So anyway, 2018 finally rolled around, and look, David Saint-Jacques and me. So I knew that a Canadian astronaut, the aforementioned David, was going to be flying soon. And the agency, the CSA, kindly invited me to go to the backup launch in June. So he was going to launch in December, but in June, he was going to be there in Kazakhstan supporting the crew going to space, right? And they warned me, they said it was a good idea to go because if I waited until December to see him actually launch into space, there were going to be two problems. First, he was going to be busy, clearly getting ready for a mission. And second, there might be so many reporters asking to go that they might have to prioritize the bigger outlets because I'm a freelancer, right? I'm a zero. But they knew I cared about the astronaut stories, and that's why they gave me this kind invitation. And I felt that it was quite a kind thing for them to do. So luckily, I did have the money. As you can see, I'm standing out in the Kazakh steppe with him there. And it was incredible. I flew out. I visited more airports on the way that I can remember, and it was hot. My Russian, which I've been working on now for 5 years, was barely functional, but I had a blast. And you can just see how close I got to the rocket and to, of course, to David. Watching the rollout was an experience I'll never forget because they take this big rocket on a set of train tracks, just like what you see, and they roll it across the countryside. And it's the same ceremony almost that Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, first person in space back in 1961 did too. And I also got to interview David a bunch of times. Like, it was great. But the reason that this happened was that I had worked to make these things line up, right? So the CSA allowed me to use my connections and my experience and my interest to go to this backup launch. And then in December, they did get that interest from other outlets. But guess what? It's expensive to go to Kazakhstan and nobody could, or few people could afford to go. And so basically what they did was they came back to the freelancers and they said, would you have the money? They invited a bunch of motivated Canadian freelancers like myself to go because some of the other reporters just couldn't do it. So they called me personally about the visa arrangements. And the first thing they said was, yes, you're invited to come with us. And I was ecstatic. So here I am again, not even expecting it, but I'm back in Kazakhstan. But this next trip was awful, simply awful. Everything went wrong. A snowstorm almost derailed me in Ottawa. I hadn't even left my city yet, okay? I had to rush out a day early. I forgot a bunch of stuff, including a charger, to get to London, UK, to catch my connection, to get to Moscow. It was a whole thing, right? And then our plane in Moscow had a problem too. So we had to land at an alternate airport in Kazakhstan instead of where the space stuff is. And we had to bus for about 3 hours in the middle of the night. And we're time jet lagged. And we get there, and this rollout that you can see in front of me was still incredible, but it was also minus 20 degrees. And we had not dressed appropriately because we were so tired. Our equipment froze, we were jet lagged. And eventually our group became so tired that, how do you politely say it? Interpersonal difficulties arose, I'll put it that way. But to this day, honestly, I think that some of it was my fault. And so the lesson about connections was I had been leveraging it very, very well up to that point, you know, with the Canadian Space Agency, with the astronauts, with everybody that I could to go to Kazakhstan and tell the story. But I didn't do that with my group when I was actually there. I should have talked to my fellow journalists. I should have said, this mission is not going to plan to get out there on time. How can we help each other to make it easier? But we didn't, and I didn't ask them. Instead, we just kept competing with each other, and out in the desert, it's not only miserable to compete, but you just can't compete because you'll die. It's just like a space mission. So I felt really cold and tired and harassed and disconnected overall, right? But what amazed me was how well David's family was doing in the same conditions, and they had all the cameras on them. But what they were doing was smarter, way smarter than what we were doing as journalists. So they brought family with them, they brought friends with them, and even with the 3 small children in tow that you see in this picture, David and his wife had built at Kazakhstan a network of support that helped them feel connected even when they were far away from home. So even if they hadn't had the family and the friends attending, they still had connections with people on site to help them through. And watching them, I remembered that my best moments on Mars at MDRS back in 2014 were from that teamwork. So happily looking at them, interacting with them, I found the right attitude just in time. So the astronauts get a ceremonial walkout minutes before going to the launch pad. And there was this Russian guard standing in military fatigues and armed, as they always are for security, standing nearby. And as I said, I learned a little bit of Russian, right? And on the one hand, he was supposed to be intimidating. His job is to protect the crew, of course, but he also is a connection. He's there because he's proud of his space program. And I thought he might want to see a journalist stand in a good area to promote his space program. And there was no harm in seeing if I was right, because if I was wrong, of course I would follow his instructions and let him tell me where to go. And so I walked up to him and I said very carefully, "Tuda." And in Russian, that means over there. And I pointed to a spot where I wanted to stand, and it was right beside the NASA television camera. And it was the only good spot left in the crowd. While I was inside taking pictures of David and his family and watching him get his spacesuit on, the crowd was building and building, and there was just nowhere else left to go, really. So otherwise, I would have been standing way too far away to see anything. And so this military person looked at me very, very sternly. That's his job, right? And he said, "Kto vi, press?" And he was asking who I was and if I was a reporter. And I answered, "Da, Kanatsky Press." And in other words, yes, I'm a Canadian reporter. And so he knew 2 things. He knew I came a long way to cover the launch. I mentioned all the airports, right? And he also knew that even though I was Canadian and spoke English and a little bit of French, I also could speak a bit of Russian. And that seemed to satisfy him, that I had made that effort to come all the way out and learn his language. And so he jerked his hand in the direction of the NASA television camera, which is obviously the best spot, right? And he says, "Tuda, over there." So if you watch the video playback of the astronauts walking out, that's where I was standing, right there. I have to thank that person, and I don't even know how to find him. So I got the same TV view right in front of me that you're seeing right there in real life. And it's a moment I'll remember to my dying day. Such a privilege. I was so lucky. There's something really humbling about seeing a Canadian about to put his life on the line like this, and to do it with such grace. David launched into space safely that day, and honestly, we didn't know if it was going to work out because the mission before him had an abort. And everything was fine with that too, but they had to make some adjustments to the rocket, all sorts of things. So David went to space with a grace that I was only just beginning to understand. So I learned one thing from him about connections at that launch, and I got to ask him a single question at this press conference about how he got ready for the mission. And his answer talked about the years of preparation that his family and his friends put in to help him go. And after this press conference, another astronaut came up to me and said it was a perfect question to ask David because it goes all the way back to how the astronauts prepare for their flight, their training, everything that goes into the mission, because the mission's only a small part of what they do. It's all that time on the ground. So I knew I'd done one thing right. I knew walking away that I made a lot of mistakes, but that I could go home happy knowing that I'd done that one thing right. And I was lucky because I was about to lose that idea about connections, and I recovered, but only because I was lucky enough to have this good example in front of me. So thank you to David and everybody else who showed me, because Mars should have taught me that lesson, but at least somebody else stepped in just in time, and I was smart enough to listen. So what are our 3 lessons so far? Being the zero, embracing diversity, and finding that connection. And Mars taught me all that. And I thought in 2018, by the time that I come home from Kazakhstan and began to write one of my books, that I'd absorbed many of the lessons and that I would have to find something new to pick up some more. But it's amazing how an experience even many years ago keeps growing over time. And something happened in 2020 that touched all of us. I'm of course talking about the pandemic. That's why I'm an avatar on a screen instead of in Montreal in person talking to all of you. So let's talk about the 4th lesson, which is touching us indeed still right now, which is dealing with this isolation. We've all been isolated to some extent for 18 long months. And of course it's not over. I'll leave aside what's going to happen next and instead talk a little bit about the implications for space, for leadership, for isolation, because I have more to say there than about what's going on in our election process. So if I may go back, here's Mars again. I was in the middle of a PhD when I was on Mars, and that's why I was invited. There was an open invitation for students at the University of North Dakota to attend the mission, and I was lucky enough to have the financial resources to do that. I asked my PhD supervisor for permission, and he kindly said yes, and it's a good thing I went, because at the time I was still trying to figure out what I was going to be writing about in this PhD, which is a years-long process in itself, and going to Mars changed my PhD research permanently. I saw how a team could come together in isolated conditions to solve problems, and that got me thinking about what kinds of leadership are best in those circumstances. So when you go to space, do you need to go in with a hard expectation of that mission and to keep shooting for that goal, regardless of what happens next, regardless of the circumstances, or do you need to flex? So I ended up studying this issue at the University of North Dakota for several years. So the picture in front of you is still from Mars, but UND also has a habitat, which I've been lucky enough to visit. And they also run long duration missions there of about 2 weeks. And so in 2018, the same year that I was in Kazakhstan, I studied 3 crews that were working at that habitat. And they kindly recorded all of their spacewalks. I went through the usual protocols that you have to do to make sure privacy was protected and their safety, but they recorded all the spacewalks and they sent all the recordings to me. Then I had one friend transcribe them, and I had 3 other friends help me analyze what the transcripts were telling us, what kind of actions were happening. So I need to be clear that I compensated my friends, and I also want to make it clear that the PhD is not about me. It was about the network of people who helped me, because it wouldn't have worked without my experience on Mars. It wouldn't have worked without the crews at the habitat. It wouldn't have worked without my friends, without my supervisor, without my patient husband, right? There's a whole network of folks behind that degree, even though I was the one walking on the stage. So the PhD I earned is not about me, but about that network. And just like any astronaut, a team of people were behind that success. So what I learned is that team members need to be situational in leadership. Things break, dangerous moments come up, and you need to adapt. And that's why, in my opinion, that training that I alluded to earlier is so important. And so I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but one of the key things that NASA wants to see in its astronauts is time working in isolation before they even get hired, okay? And if you look at most modern day astronaut biographies, most of them have this isolation experience of some sort. They might be in the military, they might be an Antarctica researcher. David, for example, he used to perform medicine in Canada's north. So luckily, during this pandemic, I was never fully isolated. I know many folks were, but I had my husband, I had a cat, we eventually got a puppy, and I was lucky enough to use Zoom more than any other tool, and I was lucky to have work. I found my way through a difficult time. I taught classes, I did interviews, I had a number of things that were helping me with this. But, Mars showed me something. And I have to be very careful as I say this, because of course I'm shaded in privilege. I don't have any need to leave the house for my work. I didn't have small children. I didn't have medical issues in my family to worry about. I still had employment. But what my husband and I did was early. We had a conversation after checking in with our circle of friends and family. When we found out that everybody else was okay, we figured that our priority was to stay healthy mentally, even under these circumstances. We had to find a way through and to find a way to contribute even in our circumstances. And if you can't take care of yourself first, none of the other lessons that I mentioned make any sense. So the zero, the diversity, the connections, it won't happen if you're paralyzed by depression or fear and anxiety. And in those moments, others should be helping you, to be clear. But any steps that you can take to take care of yourself, to address the symptoms, to be kind with yourself in the worst moments, to lean on your support network, are going to be what help keep you healthy. And so I took up yoga. What else can you do, right? I tried to listen to others' wisdom. I listened a lot. So we changed our approach to work, my husband and I, and we leaned harder into our hobbies. We used to work longer hours, and we still do, but after COVID, we began to approach it a little bit differently. So what I began to do was I used some of the money I was lucky enough to be earning, put it back into my community in many cases, hired people, bought services. And then I took a little bit of it to buy back my own time. And with that time, I've been studying history. And the first thing you know when studying history is that there's too much for a single person to know. But of all people, during my studies, Neil Postman gave me some wise words to consider. So Postman once wrote that all history is comparative. And the more I think on those words, the wiser they appear to be. So note that he uses the word comparative to compare and not competitive to compete. And so he means that the people who write history are human beings, and they are flawed, like myself. Sometimes they also use or write history deliberately to make a point about some greater philosophical item or agenda. And so Postman says that we have to be mindful of those biases because they're built into the way that we tell history. And we especially need to tell youth, those listening in tonight, about what that means, what comparative history means, and how to build their own histories. So let me give you a comparison, deliberately doing this type of comparative history. So one of my obsessions during the pandemic was a British show called Time Team. And during that show, archaeologists go to some site in Britain and they dig up a site for 3 days and they try to figure out what they just found. Now in Britain, it's a bit different than here in Canada. You can dig in your garden and come up with Roman pottery sherds. So the archaeology is a little bit different than what you might find around here. But to take the greater meaning, the archaeologists know it's important to understand the whole story as best as they can within that 3 days. And they did the best they could to leverage those connections, to be the zero, to embrace diversity, all those other things that I talked about, and to use the limited resources that they had, the time, the money, everything else. And it worked. The show was so successful that it actually ran for 20 years. So that gave me a lot of material to watch during the pandemic. And then it was canceled, but I was so convinced in their mandate that I contributed to their Patreon to bring the show back for another season this very year. They actually just finished a dig. And so that's my bias, that I support them, but I also want to give you the lesson that I learned. Space is like these archaeology digs. So far, only a few people have gone to space. Most people have only gone for a few days or a few weeks, and the longest person to have lived in space for a single moment in time was 424 days. So we're only just beginning to understand its effect on the human body, human society, etc. So it's impossible to say that we know all there is to know about space based on something like 570 people going up there. And that's why it's so hard to plan a Mars mission. There are 7 billion billion with a B people on this earth, more every day. And to date, by far, most of the people who flew in space were heterosexual, they were white, they were male, and they were from a handful of countries. And if these billionaire space people position their spaceflight right, perhaps along the lines of what Inspiration 4 just showed us, perhaps we'll be able to fly more diverse people in space. And perhaps we'll get a better sense of what space means to more people. But so far, the history of private space travel is largely just a few folks, right? And we have to start to change that. So let me return, more pictures here, one more time to Mars. So with the Mars Society, I was operating at what is known as an analog. So an analog is an environment that is kind of like space. Most of the research that has been done about space exploration and analogs has been done at places like Antarctica. And most of those participants from the early days, at least the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s and 90s, were heterosexual white males from a handful of countries. But that is starting to change. One of my crewmates actually ended up going to Antarctica, a female crewmate. So there's still a long ways to go, but I'm glad to see that that's starting to change. And I have a feeling that space may go in that direction too. So for the time being, clearly space is expensive, and space may remain close to us to explore physically, to actually be there for a long, long time. But first of all, there's other ways that you can participate, like here at RASC. And also, if you want to actually learn about the experience, you can do like what Sian Proctor did, one of the Inspiration 4 astronauts, and learn about it through analogs. So I studied analogs for my PhD, as I told you, and I'll tell you what the scientific research shows. All an analog requires of you is to be in an isolated and dangerous environment for a time. So Girl Guide Camp totally counts. You might be hiking, you might be canoeing, you might be living in a women's shelter, you might be living in a jail, you might be the odd one out at an elementary school where the other kids are bullying or harassing you. And yes, I went through that too, right? So my point is, you don't have to be privileged to make lots of money, to be a billionaire, to be living in an isolated, dangerous analog. And in fact, probably most of us have been in isolated, dangerous conditions at some point in our lives. So what you're learning amid these terrible circumstances is that leadership and teamwork are important, and that you may be able to bring those into space or activities that are related to it. And so if I may, starting to get to the end, give a call to action for space. We should be studying all sorts of analogs in history to learn more about how human beings behave. But let's just not talk about Antarctica or Utah or high seas or any of those other space analogs you might have heard about. I would like to open up the research and consider analogs in other places of other types of research. Let's bring in societies in Africa, Asia, Australia, especially indigenous societies that have been dealing with isolation and danger from the very beginning of their history. And I live my life as a journalist, an observer of society. I see a lot of great things about Canadian society that I celebrate, but I also acknowledge our terrible history. I celebrate the people who got to go to space, but I also mourn those who never made it or who died along the way. So perhaps the greatest thing that we need to know is that space requires all of our skills, all of our diversity to make it a meaningful tool for Canadian society and for societies anywhere that you might be talking about. I don't have all the answers, and I don't have the wisdom to see all the blind spots, but I can tell you that the ultimate answer to what to do in space, where we should be going next, has to be crafted from a diverse set of people. So I'm still young enough that I might make it to space. Maybe I'll even see some of the Girl Guides or some of the youth here actually go to Mars themselves. And if you do go with the expectation of collaboration. Go with the wisdom of your culture and your history and try to make this new planet a better place for us. And let's make that pale red dot in the sky a point of evolution in our story that includes as many people as possible. And whoever you are, if any of you get to go, as long as I draw breath and can type out your story well enough, I'll do my best to share your lessons learned with others. So please get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. That was really inspirational. I'm going to ask Jessica, our Jack Space Club president, to share with you some of the questions that are currently in the Q&A. I'm going to ask for the audience to please feel free to put in some more questions into the Q&A, and there's a lot of great comments going into the chat right now. And I'm just going to let everyone know from now that we're going to have the Q&A for about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to be heading into an informal discussion in the Clubhouse. So I'll be sending you a Clubhouse link in the chat towards the end of the Q&A, so please do hang around. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Jessica. Jessica?
Okay, so we got about like 10 questions. So let's see, let's start with the first one. How do you reply to someone who says you wouldn't be able to do the job, but you're not smart enough to be a scientist? Can anyone go to space?
So how, I didn't catch that. My hearing's kind of off because I have a cold. You said how about my job?
How do you reply to someone who says you won't be able to do the job, that you're not smart enough to be a scientist? Can anyone go to space?
The first thing I would say is that space requires all kinds of skills, okay? So when I was on Mars, I found out that one of my bad skills, for example, was cooking. I needed to learn more about cooking to keep my crew happy, okay? So you may feel like you're not up to speed yet, because smart is a spectrum, and smart can depend on a lot of interpretations. I think that's really important to know, but maybe it's just a moment for you to say, I'm very strong in this one particular thing. There are other things that I need to improve to be even a stronger person, and I will get there in my own time. When I was in about grade 2 or 3, this teacher handed me a book and it said Leo the Late Bloomer on it, okay? And so they were trying to give me a message because I was not connecting very well with my other students in the class at that time. I was sort of on my own doing different things and I wasn't really engaged. And I worked on that after that. And it took a long time, but I feel like I might be a little bit stronger, but it's something that I'll always have to be working on, how to put others first before myself. So smart is not only about what you might feel inherently talented at, but it's also recognizing those blind spots like I talked about earlier, and then training yourself to overcome and to adapt as best as you can under the circumstances. And you will do that through your whole life, because it's something that I feel like I still need to keep working on, even though I know that I'm better now at almost 40 than when I was almost 10. So I hope that helps you.
Okay, next question is, how is Mars Analog Research Station powered, like fuel, solar?
We had a fuel generator. So there was a generator outside that was keeping all of our electricity going, and we had electricity restrictions as well as water restrictions. So we had to be sure not to turn all the lights on at the same time and to keep an eye out. And we had 1 or 2 power outages. I remember that happening. And so I told her that there was a town 20 minutes away from us. So if we couldn't restart the generator, we had a backup. But luckily we had 2 people that were really good at restarting generators. And so we were safe. We figured it out.
Okay, interesting. Why do you teach communications and not astronomy or aerospace sciences? That's your PhD. What makes you passionate about communications?
Because communications is how we all get to know each other. And I feel that historically, there has been a disconnect, if I may call it that, between how different people communicate with each other. So my background, if you were to look at my history, I come from European settlers that came to Canada and then settled here without the permission of Indigenous peoples, right? And so I know, for example, that if I'm working with an Indigenous person, I need to acknowledge that. And I also need to be making sure to make them feel as comfortable as possible under those circumstances. And it's usually just by saying, please tell me your story, please educate me. I don't really know what you do. I don't really know what kind of society that you're from. I can never understand because I've never lived that way. Please, open up and let me know what you think would be the most appropriate thing to say. And then I also show them things. When I write them out, I make sure that everything is okay before they get published. And that's why I really feel that communication is important, because it builds bridges. We see that in space as well. There have been many times when nations are arguing on Earth, and that in space, they end up actually working pretty well together. We've had an International Space Station for 20 years, and I can't tell you how many times there have been a couple of squabbles and we didn't know it was going to keep going, but it's still there, So yeah, I feel like communications is just a good tool for kind of getting together and figuring out new ways of moving forward. And I do my best with my limited experience to help others learn their own way through it too.
Okay, next question. Why did the rich people's rocket look like ... you know?
I think it's the design. It's streamlined, but there were a few questions about that on social media. I remember the day that I went. The other rockets though don't look like that. Okay, so there's the one from Virgin Galactic that looks like a plane. And then there's also the one that just landed, Inspiration 4, and it's a SpaceX rocket. So you've probably seen those on their webcast, right? So it looks more like a rocket. So I'm sure it was an engineering decision and not anything else.
Based on your 2 weeks in the cramped Mars simulation environment, what do you think will be the key sociological or psychological issues for the 2-year Mars missions?
You get really tired after a time. And I don't mean just physically tired, but you also get mentally tired because you're in a new environment and you're trying to adapt to it all the time. Another thing was I didn't really know my crew members. Usually before you go into space, thankfully you train for a long time and you know your crew members. I made sure to call everybody before I got on the plane, just to make sure that at least I had the basics. I knew who they were, what kind of personality they had. And they were remarkable. Every single one of them had incredible backgrounds, and I knew I was going to be okay after talking to them. But it just was that adaptation happening all the time. And so the thing that you have to do is to figure out how to both be alert, but also to figure out how to relax. And you have to find the right moment for each. So when I was up on that cliff, that was not a moment to relax, okay? That was a moment to be adaptive. But when I was in my bunk, I used that time to just be by myself. And, you know, I found it hard to be in a small space with all those people all day, right? So I would just be sitting there trying to recenter myself and to read Chris Hadfield's words, you know, because his book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, is full of such wisdom. And he's been in space before. And sometimes he would talk about things that happened in space that were very similar to what I had in Mars. So I just found that that was a good way of me finding a bit of perspective and downtime. But other people read books, they played music. And if you're in space itself, you can look out the window. And we had windows. I could look outside at Mars and I could see the desert. So it gave me a little bit of perspective about geology and long time frames on Earth.
Okay, next question. I've also been wondering this. How much greenhouse really contributes to the food supply at the Mars station, and what is grown mainly?
So I didn't get to eat a thing because we only planted the seeds. So what happens is the seeds take several months to grow, and several crew members come in, several teams come in, and they take care of the seeds. Then after a period of maybe, I don't know how long it takes a plant to grow, but it depends on the plant, of course, but let's say 2 or 3 months, you can start to eat some of them. So some of the crew members at the end, some of the teams at the end got to eat the seeds, but we were the ones planting them. So that was kind of fun too, because I was learning a lot about biology, right? One other thing that you're learning in a space or an environment like I was in an analog is you're always picking up new skills. And so I was learning new languages. I was learning new skills like biology, how to plant plants, how to take care of them. It's amazing what you pick up so quickly. It's just like being in any kind of rich environment. Even when you get to go on camping, you learn a lot very quickly, even if it's only a couple of days.
What's it like to meet an astronaut? Are they different before and after you go to space? Would they come meet us, or does it cost too much for kids?
Those are good questions. Okay, so I've been lucky enough to talk to a few astronauts, and they are people that always put the team first. They are the most humble individuals I've ever met. So lovely. And the reason that astronauts are that way, because can you imagine if you had a bunch of people with an ego in a spacecraft, it wouldn't go well, right? You know, like you need to be listening to each other and working well with each other. So they're humble before they go up there. And if I see any changes when they come back, they're usually even more humble because it's an experience. They know that they were so lucky to go up there and to come back, and very few people have gone. Like I said, less than 600 people, and not even everybody went safely, right? And so then they come back, and usually what happens is when they begin to retire, most astronauts keep going. They're not astronauts anymore in that sense, but what they do is they work with youth. They join organizations like the RASC. They give talks. They're devoted to education and often to things like the environment, science, literacy. There's this one astronaut I was talking to earlier in the summer. Her name's Karen Nyberg, and she started a clothing line. And the reason she helped do that was it's promoting science, technology, engineering, and math for multiple genders. And so she has like a dinosaurs in space line. And the idea is she wanted to make sure that multiple genders have access to it. So it's incredible just watching them. And as I said, they're the most humble, lovely people. I love talking to astronauts.
Okay, next question. Why do you keep saying to be a zero? A zero is so bad in school.
So I'll first of all say that I am not the math expert, okay? But what we're talking about is proportion, okay? So it's not maybe literally the number zero, but it's about finding a spot on the scale between being helpful, being too helpful, and being not helpful at all, okay? So if you picture a 3-year-old, so that I'm not offending anybody, okay? If the 3-year-old's on the ground screaming, having a tantrum, they're not being helpful, okay? And then if the 3-year-old is just kind of sitting there neutrally, maybe talking with people, they're being a 0, right? Okay. And then if they're being a +1, they're sort of being overly helpful. They're trying to do a little bit too much, you know? Sometimes they do so much that they kind of get in your way, right? Like maybe you're in the kitchen and you're trying to get your food done and the 3-year-old thinks they're helping and then they take something off the counter and they spill it. And that's kind of like what a +1 would be. It's somebody who's trying to be so helpful that they're getting in their own way. So maybe don't see it so much as numbers, but just as a scale. And so keep asking yourself, the key question is, what does this other person need? And what can I do to help them? And the key is not to help them in a way that you're going to be expecting praise at the end, okay? It's not so you're going to get a reward. The reason that you're helping them is because you actually care about them. And usually the other person can tell if you're actually caring about them, right? It's true of family members, of friends, even pets can tell. My dog can tell if I care about him, right? So act towards the person, do what would be helpful for them and do it in a way that shows that you care, and don't expect an award or praise or reward at the end. Just be there as a person. And if you take that ability and that skill into your work and into your school and into your life, then usually you will get some help in return because people can tell that you care about the topic and about what you're doing.
Psychologically, what was the most difficult thing you have experienced in life and while living on Mars analog station?
The most difficult thing I experienced in life and on Mars and in Kazakhstan, all those 3? Okay, so Kazakhstan, it probably was somewhere around the time that I was standing outside of our bus in the cold, locked out. So for context, we were in this bus being brought to all the areas. They brought us to the rocket, they brought us to the launch pad, they brought us to the astronaut places, and it broke. The stupid door broke on the bus at one point, and we were standing outside. It was -20. I was jet lagged, I was tired, and as I indicated, the journalists weren't working well together. So it broke and I couldn't get back in the bus and the people inside the bus couldn't get out. The driver was heroic. He jumped out of the bus, and he's a Russian. He's a person who lives right there. And he just got down on the ground with his tools and he just fixed it. And he was the hero of the day, right? Because I was sitting there like complaining, and he just got out and fixed it and did his job and moved on. And so that was probably my worst moment in Kazakhstan. In Mars, briefly, it was when we had the difficulties with the crew member, and that was partly my fault, but we recovered. In life, I think that layoff was probably one of them. It was one of those moments where I wasn't sure if I was going to be a journalist the next day, you know? But I just said, I'm going to be the 0. I'm going to try and help. I'm going to reach out to folks and say, I'm available. If you need a journalist right now, I'm available. And as it turned out, somebody needed one the next day. But things come up, you know, like there have been health scares, there have been family difficulties. Life is just like that sometimes. 2020 was really hard on a lot of us, but I also want to keep acknowledging just how lucky I am, because I think that the more interesting story is to ask somebody who wasn't so lucky, you know, how they got over a cancer diagnosis, for example, right? Or how they sort of worked through that. The crew that's on Inspiration 4 that just came down, they did this lovely 10-minute video with patients from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis. And if you want some perspective, go and watch these patients because they're all 10 years old and they're fighting a battle. And they're just so excited to talk to these astronauts. And I think, again, I prefer to talk about people like that rather than my own difficulties because I'm lucky. And some people just need to have their story told more urgently than I do, I think.
Okay, next question. How useful and helpful the social media and virtual reality would be for the facilitation of the long-term isolation during a Mars mission or other space missions? How big is the urge sometimes to find some private space away from everyone during such a mission? And is it possible?
They already have virtual reality in space, actually. So there's a underwater facility I didn't have time to talk about called NEEMO, N-E-E-M-O. And so NASA astronauts and other people too go down in Florida for a few weeks in this habitat, and they tested virtual reality technology. And the way it's useful on a Mars mission and what they were testing is, say you've been in grade 3, okay? And you finished grade 3 and you did your math, and then you went to grade 4 and you might have forgotten some of the math in grade 3. So the idea is this virtual reality teaches them or reteaches them what they forgot. So it's the same kind of idea. So if they were training in detail for how to fix something that broke, and they did it 2 years ago, they might have forgotten all the steps. And so then they get into the virtual reality, and just like any app, it's a tool that teaches you or reteaches you how to do it. They also can send up what's called just-in-time training. And what that is they have videos that are recorded on Earth, and then they send these videos out to the astronauts and ask to help them fix something very unusual. So it's another thing that they're kind of pioneering up there. And they're always looking for more ideas. So if you're more into the computer side of things, maybe you could be trying to help develop apps and ideas to connect folks, because the larger lesson is this is not only helpful on a space mission, but it also is helpful up north. Imagine if you're trying to install a piece of equipment in the middle of Nunavut and you don't have easy access to internet unless a Starlink goes by, right? So what kind of resources can you give that person to make sure that they can set up the internet safely? And is there anybody in the local community also who might have some of those resources and you can get them involved and have Indigenous participation? There's a lot of ways of thinking through this problem. So I just answered a part of it, but hopefully you can start to think and kind of keep on going after my lecture.
Are you okay with 3 more questions, Elizabeth?
I'm fine, yeah, I'm just sitting here, so go
Okay,
ahead.
perfect.
What do you think about Elon Musk's push to go to Mars? Do you believe this will happen in the next decade?
I had a conversation with space journalist Eric Berger, B-E-R-G-E-R. He just wrote a book about Elon Musk and SpaceX, which you can probably find at your library because most libraries have these books. But even if not, I'll tell you what he said. He wrote this book. He followed SpaceX for about 10 years. And so he's the expert more than me. Like, I do write stories, but not as many stories as he has. And he said, this is what I think is special about SpaceX. And I said, what? And he said, I think that SpaceX can do almost anything it wants to do. It just might take a bit more time. So to answer your question directly, if I borrow from Eric's thinking, he probably will get there, but it probably will take longer than 10 years. So if you're super young right now, maybe that gives you a bit more time to train, a bit of hope.
What do your current history studies focus on? Are they informed by your B1 diversity, connection, and isolation themes?
So I wanted to study history when I was in high school and in university, but I got to university and my journalism was so busy, I couldn't find the time. The classes would be held all day, like literally 8 to 4 p.m. And the history classes usually were right in the middle of that time, so I couldn't go. And so I had to abandon the idea or extend the degree. And I wasn't going to sit there for longer than 4 years. I wanted to finish and, you know, go and get a job and actually earn money instead of spending money. But, you know, these are life choices. So 20 years passed, okay. And after I got my PhD, I remembered this. I felt like something was missing, and I remembered that I had wanted to study history when I was in high school. So there's a great university here in Canada called Athabasca, And Athabasca will let you study maybe a few courses if you want, or you can do a whole degree, or you can do a certificate. And they're really flexible. You don't have to attend classes there. They have it all online, and they're going to have a new platform very soon that has even more interactive elements than right now. So that's how I'm doing it. I'm doing it through a place called Athabasca. And my focus is I'm helping actually in something to do with Rome and Britain. Like the Romans were in Britain for a time. And I'm also interested in how women were interacting at that time too, because the more I study history, the more I feel like I should be saying more about women. And I'm trying to bring that into my stories too. And other genders, obviously.
Okay, last question. Are the suits and helmets really sealed and isolating the person from the outside environment?
Are the suits and helmets really sealed and isolating the person from the environment? So I think this person means on Mars, you know,
yeah,
when
like the
I'm RASC.
simulation.
Okay,
Yeah.
these are simulated. So it's a big old bubble, like a fish tank, not as heavy, obviously, and it's over your head. And then you have a backpack, and the backpack has something heavy in it. So you're walking around feeling, well, heavy, you know. So these weren't real. I also was using hiking boots, but it's as close as we could get, because the key is if you're switching to a real life spacesuit, they're bulky, okay? So it's hard to move without training. And there also is an element of, I don't quite want to say danger, that's probably the wrong word, but you have a situation where you have gas recirculating inside and it's hard to get out without help. And so if we don't have a lot of training, it's really difficult to be operating it correctly. So that's another reason they don't have it out there. And I think a third one is they're very expensive and hard to maintain. And I told you we're in the middle of the Utah desert, so there's hardly anybody around to maintain them. At NASA, I'm sure they're fixing their spacesuits all the time, and they do it in space all the time too. So it just wasn't practical. I did get to try one on just quickly at the University of North Dakota. They do research there, but I did that one inside of a lab, and I had one person behind me and I had two people in front of me because I had no training, right? And if anything went wrong, I would have three folks right on me, taking the thing off and helping me out. So it goes to show you how careful you got to be to get this done. These were such great questions. I wish that I had more time to answer everybody. And if I did something unclearly, I would ask that somebody at RASC forward the questions to me, and I can rephrase or add more material just to make sure that I'm being as thorough as I can in a short period.
I definitely will. And I do have to connect your last answer to your previous answer. I'm hoping we don't get another instance of NASA sending women up to do a spacewalk and forgetting to send the right size spacesuits. So that's one of those egg on the face that I think we need to really embrace the diversity, and not just the gender diversity, but also different body types from different countries that are now participating in these space missions that weren't really acknowledged or even accommodated for in the early stages of space exploration. So I want to thank you, Elizabeth. This was fantastic. This was inspirational. A lot of the comments have been just outstanding in the chat. I do want to pass it over. David, did you have any last comments you wanted to make before we pass it to Paul for closing remarks?
No, I just wanted to say that I really, really did enjoy this presentation, and it brought me back to my own early experiences with space and up until the present. This is not the 60s. We're not going to the moon anymore. And whatever happens, happens, but it's good that the dream to be in space and to look at space through a telescope is still alive. Thank you.
Definitely. I like the picture that you shared with yourself at an observatory. That was good. But it's inspirational to hear about the experiences, getting to go and see some of the launches and getting to go and see some of these sites where they're trying to prepare for environments that really are unknown for us, physically at least unknown. So Paul, I'll call on you to do the final thank yous, and then we'll move over to the clubhouse for more informal discussion.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Dr. Howell, for your amazing talk. And hopefully we get to hear from you again in the future. I hope you're willing to do another talk in the future, that is. And I hope everybody would come to the next presentation that's on September 22nd, and also that all members, as much as possible, come to our AGM in November. Participation is welcome because it is your club. Please participate. And that's about it. So hopefully we can meet all in the clubhouse tonight. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So the clubhouse is open. We are also in the clubhouse again on Wednesday, the 22nd, as Paul mentioned. And on the 25th, we'll be with Explore Alliance for a 45-degree global star party. Please do join us. Visit our RASC Montreal Center website for more information and for the calendar. And I'm going to stay online here for another 5-10 minutes to help people if they have trouble getting into the clubhouse. But I will stop the recording and I will thank you all and drive safe. Make sure to have some good snacks tonight, and we will see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.